Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, a Fox Sports and Speed Cafe Formula One podcast. On today's episode, we're giving our mid-season driver ratings as the clock counts down to the resumption of racing for next weekend's Dutch Grand Prix. My name is Michael Laminato, motorsport writer for Fox Sports Australia, and it's great to have your company, and of course the company of my co-host from Speed Cafe. He'd back a public holiday if Australia won the World Cup, if only motorsport journalists got public holidays in the first place. It's Matt Kosh.
We work more public holidays and weekends than we do during the week, don't we? I mean, that said, we've had a couple of weeks off. I'm having withdrawals. I can't actually hold my hands still anymore. I'm gagging for the season to get going, and it's only been a week and a half or whatever it's been.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got to take these moments, because then all of a sudden we're doing 2 or 3 in a row, and you just want to be able to sleep a little bit. So take the opportunity while you can.
Sleep's overrated. There's plenty of time for that over Christmas and New Year when it all settles down. But no, let's get back into it. We're mid-season. Let's go.
Yes, well, look, I figured the way we can kind of bridge the gap, because we are only really, 10 days, not even, till cars get back on track at Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix. It's weird to say that's where we're resuming in the Netherlands. It's meant to be Belgium. We've already done that. It's just the way the calendar works these days. But by giving a little bit of a report card of where we think, let's say the top 10 certainly is in this Formula One season. The top 10 of 21 drivers as it is always the curveball, having cycled through already one driver at AlphaTauri in the shape of Nick De Vries, Daniel Ricciardo back in. We've done many podcasts on that. If you want to go, if that's news to you can go back and have a listen to some of those. But I figure the way we do this, Matt, is we just run through our top 10. I suspect some of our top 10 will be similar, but as we get down to the guts of it, I suspect there'll be some differences. And of course, we'd love to hear from you in the comments who you think the top 10 performers of the season to date are. You can also go through the top 21 if you like, all of the drivers, that is. You can even rank the reserve drivers too if that really takes your fancy. You've got enough time on your hands. But Matt, I suspect number one, at least I'm going to say my number one, is Max Verstappen at this point, the runaway championship leader. Is that a fair call?
I was going to say, why are you giving him number one? What's he done this year? Hardly seen him on TV, because he's been running away. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair, isn't it? I mean, he's got over 300 points. He's over 100 clear of his teammate in the same car. Well, not in the same car, but one that's very similar to it. Yeah. How do you go past Max Verstappen? Or no one knows how to go past Max Verstappen this year, it seems.
You got to start ahead of him after a qualifying issue, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The guy's been phenomenal. Red Bull has been phenomenal this year, and you've got to capitalise when you're given a car like that, and the greats do. We saw it with Michael Schumacher, with Sebastian Vettel, with Lewis Hamilton. Even before then, you go to Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, and you can wind the clock back to Fangio and Clark. They always got the best out of their cars. Jackie Stewart. So he's done that. He's done everything he needs to do. He's established himself as the benchmark, and he's the man that everyone's trying to be. I mean, he's won the last 8 races on the bounce. It's pretty formidable. I think we'd probably have to hand our media passes back if we didn't rate him number one this year, wouldn't we?
Hey, there's always room for edgy takes on this podcast, I'm willing to say, but anything else might be a little bit too edgy. Just if my maths serves me correctly, and I did do this calculation a couple of times, but still could be wrong knowing me and numbers. But Max Verstappen, of all the points available to be scored up to 12 rounds, including 3 sprints, he's dropped only 22 from the maximum score for this point of the season, which is, I mean, you're a bit more of a numbers guy than me, Matt, but I think that's pretty much stacking it up when we're considering he's won, like you said, the last 8 and a couple more before that. All of the sprints he's swept. He's got a swag of fastest laps. It's the only record this season that he hasn't absolutely dominated, but we know the fastest lap point is a little bit of a nebulous, miscellaneous point. It's not always going to the driver who should have absolutely been fastest on the day. But to have dropped only 22 points, I can understand why some people will say, oh, well, that just proves the car is so much better. But as you said, it's that gap to Sergio Perez at the same time. It's 125 points. That you can't, in those circumstances, say, well, he's just driving the best car. He's clearly, and it doesn't even really matter what you think about Sergio Perez, does it? He's clearly operating on such a significantly higher level of a driver who is well established. He's a race winner. He's a pole getter. real specialist midfield operator, which sometimes sounds like a bit of a backhanded compliment, but I think really should just be a regular front-handed compliment, if you like, because it is difficult to rise above in the midfield. It's so close historically. Yeah. That's the enormous performance for me in those two sort of points figures.
Yeah, I mean, the midfield is absolutely cutthroat. You're very fair in what you say there, and that it's a forehand compliment. It's not a backhand compliment. But yeah, I mean, I haven't actually done that maths myself in terms of the points he's dropped, but just looking at it, Azerbaijan off the cuff will be his worst performance, and he only this is Max Verstappen, he only walked away with 24 points that weekend. Sergio Perez picked up 33, so he dropped a few points, but he's not dropped many all year, and that really is a massive feather in his cap, and it just goes to show that he is on a different plane. Sergio Perez is no slouch. There are no bad drivers in Formula One. They're bad comparison to one another, but we're talking, I think I've said this before, single-digit percentage differences between Lewis Hamilton and Logan Sargent. They are all extraordinarily good. But for Max to be that far clear, it's... Yeah, I mean it's the days of Fernando Alonso and his Formula 2 engine for everyone else almost, isn't it? That's how far clear that Max Verstappen is. For me, I mean, he's won the World Championship, let's be honest.
Have you done the maths for when he can win it as well? That's something I haven't done yet, and I'm not sure if I'm emotionally prepared for it.
I have. Based on if he doesn't score a point between now and... How did I work this out? It was the Mexican Grand Prix. It was assuming that an individual, namely Sergio, scored maximum points between now and the end of the year. What the earliest point he could wrap that up is. So, yeah, Mexico City. Because someone had suggested to me, it'll be the US Grand Prix. And I thought, that seems a little bit early. But I believe it's Mexico City based on... this is a little while ago. I did the maths as well. But imagine that. Winning it on the home soil of the bloke who mounted your biggest threat, who faded very quickly, whose role was drawn into question mid-season, and then going in and winning it on his home soil. That's... obviously it wouldn't be the first time a championship been won in Mexico. It seems to be sort of the preferred place these days. But that'd be quite something, wouldn't it? It'd be interesting to see the reaction of the crowd in the stands that weekend.
Yeah, I think so. They know how to throw a party, but it's probably not their preferred circumstances for one. All right, well, unanimous on number one. I'll let you go for driver number 2 in this combined Fox Sports Speed Cafe ranking. Who's your pick?
It's difficult because I don't think we can say Sergio Perez. And I say that because he hasn't been consistent enough. He's tallied there in the Drivers' Championship. So, rightly you could argue that the Drivers' Championship, there's your top 10, job done. Very short podcast this week, folks. See you next week. But I don't think it's that simple because I don't think he's maximised the package that he's been given. I think a driver who has, or at least has come close, is Fernando Alonso. That car, for what he's done with it through the first, call it 6 or 8 races of the year, he absolutely maximised what was available to him. 6 podiums in 8 races. He's still third in the championship. He's just hanging on to that one from Lewis Hamilton. He's only a point clear. But I can't think of a mistake he's made. Can't think of an instance, other than perhaps Monaco, where he arguably should have won. But even still, to finish second is so far above expectations for Aston Martin started the year out, and it's as good as a win, isn't it? So Fernando Alonso, for me, is second best so far this season.
Yeah, look, another one I've got to agree on. I mean, Monaco...
I changed my mind.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, but Monaco, I can't even necessarily fault him because for me it was a little bit... that at least is shared with the team, the fact that he couldn't win that Grand Prix. And it is ultimately hypothetical whether or not he could have won it, but certainly the numbers suggest he probably could have with a better call. The only mistake I can think of was in the sprint in Belgium where he slid off in pretty poor conditions, and as we've kind of learned, particularly from the more experienced drivers, they don't always take the sprint extremely seriously. Lewis Hamilton often says that explicitly doesn't really care about the sprint. And, it's like you can't really blame him too much about that when there's not heaps on the line. I think he was only fighting for 1 or 2 points at the time. But maximizing the machinery is kind of what rankings like this boil down to, because you can only really assess a driver, particularly in a sport as spread out as Formula One is, at least compared to Red Bull Racing. You can only really figure out what they're doing in comparison to the car, and you can really only figure that out by comparing them to their teammate. He's outscored Lance Stroll by 317%, according to my maths, which is enormous. Like, that's pretty significant. The largest gap only, and I think we've said this in a previous podcast, of all the drivers ahead of only the Haas teammates, but they've scored so few points between them that you can't really make a like-for-like comparison there. I mean, the Aston Martin for a lot of this season was the second quickest car, and Fernando Alonso was putting it there. As we've said, he was putting it in victory contentions when it could be there. I think what's interesting in the second half of the season is where that car ends up and what that does to Fernando. I don't think there's any risk of a motivation breakdown for him, because I think this whole season, no matter where it ends up, has been a really big shot in the arm for him and for that team. But where the sense of optimism about his performance ends at the end of this year is what I'm really sort of looking forward to by the time we get to Abu Dhabi, because it was so much of a good news story, and will be kind of no matter what. They're not going to finish lower than fourth in it'd be a real shock if they did lower than fourth in the constructors' standings this year. So it's always going to be good news compared to where they've come from. But considering we were talking about them as being maybe Red Bull's logical challenger next year at some points earlier this season, how they feel if they end up sort of, kind of third, roughly fourth, is going to be really interesting. But at least at this point in time, the Fernando-Aston combination for me has been the second best.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair, and it's a massive financial windfall for the team as well. Not that it really needs the money, but just takes a lot of pressure off that team after it's just sunk a bunch of money on new facilities and personnel and all that sort of stuff. So it's good return on investment for all their efforts there in recent years. It's not just, this hasn't happened overnight. Every overnight success takes 15 years, and this has taken a couple of years to get to this point. So I think Fernando's in the right place at the right time for once.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? Although there's still time for him to be proved wrong. So wait and see how it pans out ultimately. The fight for second and third for me was difficult, because while Fernando just had that little bit of extra, I guess, feel-good factor behind it and some really, really strong opening performances at the start of the year, it was close between him and, I'll bring up number 3 now in our ranking, at least from my perspective, and Lewis Hamilton, who maybe some might find controversial because he's been pretty closely matched with George Russell, and I think some people are still feeling like, maybe not that the jury is out on George Russell, but he's still relatively new to the game alongside a 7-time world champion, so to be relatively closely matched, at least in pure qualifying pace, maybe means he shouldn't be third. But for me, it's the bounce back compared to last year. Last year I think there were, I don't want to say genuine questions asked of Lewis Hamilton in a broad sense, because we all know what he's capable of, and last year's car I think was a bit of a shock to him, certainly in the first half of the year. But the bounce back relative not only to his form last year, but to George Russell, man, the points gap is relatively large. Yes, there's some luck and stuff in there, but nonetheless, he's been scoring very consistently this year. His pace has picked up as well. I've been really heartened just in the sense of wanting to see him eventually compete for that 8th world title, to get another chance, to see the way he's bounced back this year, and for me, that's put him into third.
It's not a bad shout. I can absolutely see your logic. I don't agree with it all, but I can see it, and I don't agree with it because I think there's another driver that for me has performed better than Lewis. Lewis has done okay, and he's certainly scored the lion's share for Mercedes, which, based on our logic thus far, suggests that he's probably got the most out of it, or close to the most out of what Mercedes has got. But I think someone who's got the most out and perhaps even exceeded a little bit expectations is Alex Albon. I like it. I put him up above Lewis Hamilton because nothing's expected of Alex, and yet here's a guy in arguably the slowest car in the grid who this year, building on what he did last year, but arguably this year, has completely rebuilt his Formula One career to the point where I've seen some outlets suggesting that even he's a wild card for Sergio Perez's drive in 2025, a return to Red Bull. So that goes to show how well he's performed. I mean, you can't really look at Williams in terms of points, But again, he scored every point. Logan Sargent hasn't scored one. That's no slight on Logan. He's still a rookie. But Alex has been phenomenal. I can't think again of a single mistake, but I can think of instances where he's outperformed that car. And Canada immediately springs to mind in that. I can't remember if it was 9th or 10th at the flag there. Just got beaten in the drag to the line by Lance Stroll off the top of my head. But he, to me, is stuck out more than Lewis Hamilton, because we sort of expect Lewis Hamilton to be there or thereabouts. We don't expect to be talking about Alex Albon. But I found myself talking and writing about Alex far more than I expected to this year.
It's a fair call. I think maybe the only reason I don't put him all the way up to third is because I still remember the big crash from Australia where really big points were on offer in a weirdly competitive start to Williams' season. Maybe looks a little bit less weird in retrospect now that we know more about how that car works and when it works, and there's always that little, I guess, random element at the start of the year when everyone's trying to get the most out of their cars. Not that, I mean, I don't feel like drivers should be marked down by single incidents, but when you're in a back-marking car, you've got to take every opportunity you do. And I do think he has taken probably 99% of his chances. I think you're spot on there. It's not necessarily an argument that he shouldn't be ranked as highly as third. I just think that that's maybe why I wouldn't put him in the top three. But that does still, on the other hand, does feel harsh. So I can understand your arguments there. But I think he's a good shout. He's definitely in my top 10. There's no doubt about that, because he has been such a strong performer. And I've really enjoyed seeing this rebirth of Alex Albon, if you like, post-Red Bull era. It's funny how some drivers do tend to flourish when they're not in the Red Bull program. And that rumour about him going back to Red Bull, I don't know. I almost don't. I'd love to see him in competitive machinery, obviously, more competitive machinery. But I'd almost prefer if he could just find a different team that wasn't Red Bull, because I just am worried about that prospect.
Well, he's young enough that he can probably hang around at Williams for a few years and not do himself too much. I mean, obviously, the risk is that you hang around at a smaller team for too long, and you sort of become a little bit of a Nico Hulkenberg, where you've got all this potential and you're tarred with the wrong brush, so to speak. You've probably got a podium in you, in Nico Hulkenberg's case, but it's never had that machinery. And if you stay in that sort of midfield battle too long, you just become another midfield driver. So, yeah, I mean, James Vowles is talking a good game, but he's also talking a long game at Mercedes to see that team more competitive. So Alex, realistically, if he's not scoring solid points and challenging for podiums next year, which seems unlikely, let's be honest, it's Williams, it's a long-term game there, he probably needs to be finding himself another drive so that he can do that. So he's contractually, I guess the cycle works for him, which is a point in favour of the rumour. But yeah, Red Bull alongside Max Verstappen, if you're an aspiring driver at this point looking to really carve your name and make a career for yourself in Formula One, is that a seat you want? You know, let's face it, Alex Albon and Daniel Ricciardo, for instance, are in very different positions in their career. They've got very different motives in wanting, or in what they want from their next contract. So, yeah, it's. I take your point about Australia as well and the crash there. That one had slipped my mind if I'm brutally honest, but I guess that also shows the strength of his performances of late. That can be erased, and that you're only as good as your last race. If we'd have done this after the Australian Grand Prix, I dare say wouldn't have been in either of our top tens. I wonder where Lewis Hamilton would have been out of interest, because Mercedes also had a slow start to the year, didn't they? But yeah, it's line ball. I see your point on Lewis, but I'm going to stay firmly in the Alex Albon camp.
No, I'm happy with that. And the good news for you is that I think you get to pick number 4 now.
Oh,
so
right.
Who comes behind Alex Albon?
Lewis Hamilton.
Oh, fair enough. Well, I feel like that's nice and convenient in terms of the running order of the show. We don't have to talk about it anymore.
It'll be interesting to see who you put in as number 4, because my reasons for putting him there are pretty much bang on with what you've said. He's been very consistent. He's delivered what you would expect of him. I don't look at last year compared to this year and sort of put weight into the bounce back, because you don't spend 15 years in Formula One winning in pretty much every season that he's done that by having big swings in form. I put that more down to the car and Mercedes struggling to get to grips with the current regulation set. So now they've got a little bit more of an idea. You're starting to see that car move forwards, and as a result, Lewis Hamilton is getting happier. It's still not a nice car, we're not seeing the best out of Lewis, and that's not a reflection again on his performance. That's a reflection on the fact that the car is such a massive factor in Formula One. So it'll be interesting. I know they're changing things like driving position and all that sort of jazz for next year. So hopefully Mercedes get on top of that, and we can see Lewis challenging for race wins and that 8th championship, because it's something that no one has ever done. We've got Michael Schumacher and Lewis on 7 and Fangio on 5, and once upon a time we thought that was going to be unbeatable. Prost got close with 4. So to have Lewis, everyone will argue whether he's the best of all time, but he's certainly the best of our time. And there's just more races, there's more opportunities for him. He's being more consistent, the cars are more reliable. Add all that together, and you're going to get a driver who, on the top of their game, is going to remain at the top of their game for a long time. And again, Lewis has maximised what he's got. So, yeah, I think a reinvigorated Lewis is helping drive Mercedes, but a reinvigorated Mercedes is helping drive Lewis. So they've got that sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a positive spiral of sorts at Mercedes, I think. So for that reason, I put Lewis at number 4. He's been solid, but not spectacular, but he's led the way for Mercedes.
Yeah, the positive spiral, I think, has been really key, because you can see that at some races where the car does feel like it's moving forwards, and then at the races where they seem a bit confounded, he's not often at his best. And he has spoken, interestingly, about saying he doesn't feel like he's been at his best pretty much since 2021, which I thought was a really interesting admission. But certainly we're all, as much as he is, hanging out for that second Max versus Lewis showdown. Everyone except perhaps Toto Wolff and Christian Horner. So, well, who cares what they think, really? It's all about us. It's people who are interested in watching it. All right, well, let's move on now.
Hey, you've not given me your number 4 yet. I want to know who you got.
What I'm going to say.
Oh, right, here we go.
Either my number 4 or our collective number 5, I guess. We should have figured out how we're going to shake out the group ratings at the end, but it's a problem for later. Because my next 3 are really tightly grouped. So it is pretty line ball between all of them. But at the top of this little group, I've put Lando Norris, because I think that he had a pretty strong opening part of the season, as strong as you could have for that car, which sort of kept him in, let's say, the upper midfield in terms of points when he probably didn't deserve to be in terms of the machinery. And then once he started getting those upgrades we've talked so much about at the Austrian Grand Prix, has barely really put a foot wrong. I mean, scored great points in Austria when he really only had 50% of that total upgrade package available to him. Then a couple of podiums. His Silverstone performance was really, really strong. Led Max Verstappen for a little bit. Held off at that defence against Lewis Hamilton after the safety car restart at Silverstone. I thought was really impressive, because for all of the talk, I guess, expectation that Lando Norris is a potential future world champion or of that caliber, we don't know. He hasn't had an opportunity to prove it yet. There have been really precious few opportunities to do it. And if you want to be really harsh, he had the opportunity to win in Russia a couple of years ago and couldn't do it. Now, the reason he couldn't do it is because that arrival of rain and really high pressure stakes made the wrong call understandable. But then you could argue the race before that was beaten fair and square by Daniel Ricciardo to Monza. So there has been, I guess, a persistent little question mark about his ultimate ability, but for me, really put that to bed in this last string of races. If you wanted to be a little bit harsh, he does still have that habit of putting his head down a little bit when things aren't going his way. I think about the radio in Belgium, for example, when it looked like the race was unraveling, but doesn't ever really translate to his performances because brought that race back to him. So for me, he's the next of this, I guess, just below top 3 group, however we're going to exactly number them. But I think he's just had another really strong year, or is having anyway.
I think that's an absolutely fair call. The Aussie in me wants to say Oscar Piastri's been much better, but let's be honest, he hasn't. In any metric you choose, Lando Norris has been the better of the McLaren drivers. So Lando Norris does deserve to be ranked higher. It's not to say Oscar's done a poor job by any stretch of the imagination. There's different metrics for his performance. But yeah, I think Lando has been a standout performer. He's underscored some of the potential that he's got. He's also stepped up this year. Let's keep in mind, this is the first time he's been the more experienced driver during his Formula One career. He's 23, he's a year older than Oscar, and yet he's the more experienced driver in Formula One. And that's something I saw a little bit of that coming through while Daniel was there, because while Daniel was sort of going through his own troubles, the team really, I felt, lent on Lando to push the car forward because Daniel just wasn't able to do that. And I think that's happened this year. There's a sort of a different Lando this year. He's more confident. He's almost more mature, even though he's still cheeky and childish and all of those sort of things that we love. That's his personality. It's great. We want that. But underlying it, there's just this air of confidence, particularly since Austria, I think, when we got that first glimpse of the upgrade package, and then since Silverstone on, there's been a little bit of a swagger there. And even before that, getting into the points when that car arguably had no right to. We've got to take the Australian Grand Prix out of the equation because pretty much if you reach the flag there, you've got points. So take that one out of the equation. And his performances, they haven't always been stunning in that we've written headlines about them, but he's done what the team needs. He's reached the flag. He's made the most of his package. And we're going to say that time and time again. It's a case of making the most of what you've got available because that's the only thing that we can really measure on. We've got a bit of an idea of where the cars stack up. So if a driver sits a nominal, out of kilter with that order, then they've got to impress, don't they? So I think by that rationale, I think Lando Norris is fourth or fifth, depending whose scorecard you choose to follow at this point.
Well, I'm really interested to see who's next on your list now, because this is, like I said, the really interesting part of the ranking. So the top 3 or 4, okay, we had a couple of differences. They kind of make up themselves. This is, for me, the really interesting part of the ranking. So who are you putting just behind Lando?
I don't think you'll even have this driver in your top 10.
Okay.
But he's caught my eye. Guan Yu Zhou.
Okay, that is a great pick. He was not in my top 10. Please go on.
So, Guan Yu Zhou, again, he's not a guy we write headlines about. But if you look at Alfa Romeo Sauber this year and compare him against Valtteri Bottas, and Valtteri is a known quantity to us. He's a race winner, raced alongside Lewis Hamilton. We know what he can do and how good he is. But Zhou has been the leading Sauber driver this year for a number of races. Bottas has got out of the car and he hasn't been able to explain what's been going on. I can think of the Australian Grand Prix. He had no idea why it was so slow. The Spanish Grand Prix, similar story, although it turned out that there was damage on his car. Zhou has just been quietly going about scoring points where they're available. The Alfa Romeo isn't a good car this year. They know that. They sort of lost their way midway through last year, and that's had a knock-on into this year. I'm just having a cheeky look at my championship points here so I can compare he and Bottas. And points-wise, it's fairly even. It's 5 points for Bottas, 4 points for Zhou, but Zhou's just been more consistent. I think he's been getting more out of that car and more out of that team. And for that reason, I put him higher than, say, a George Russell or even a Charles Leclerc, because Leclerc and Sainz and the Ferrari guys, we expect them to be at the front, and they haven't been. They haven't been consistent either, and I think both of them have made mistakes. I can't think of a mistake that Guan Yu Zhou has made. Obviously, his blushes are a little bit covered by the fact that he runs in the midfield, and that's harder for us to keep tabs on. The TV doesn't follow it as much. There's not so much interest in following what happens in the battle for 14th. But I can't think of too many instances where I think, that was a mistake. But I can think of a couple of instances where I go, oh, that's impressive. For a point, wasn't he on provisional pole at one point over the Hungarian Grand Prix? I was there that weekend. I remember the media room going up in arms as that's happened, cheering for him. I'm pretty sure it was a provisional pole at some point over the Hungarian Grand Prix. I think he's been the surprise package. Not only does he firmly fit in my top 10, I think he's also been the biggest surprise of 2023.
I think it's a good call. The only reason why I wouldn't put him quite so high is that it really depends on where you're putting Valtteri Bottas as the benchmark. Now, he's a hugely experienced driver, and I rate Valtteri, but he's never been a particularly great racing driver. He's always been pretty quick in qualifying, and despite Zhou getting much closer this year, still hasn't really quite been on Valtteri Bottas. Now, that's not a slight, because Bottas took the fight to Lewis Hamilton in qualifying. Hamilton, the greatest qualifier of all time. But then in the races, it's been much more even. And again, none of these are sort of reasons why Joe shouldn't be regarded as having a great first half of the year. Only that for me, he's not really, that doesn't make him top 5 or top 6. He's having a great second season in Formula One, no doubt about that. In difficult machinery that's not only been not quick enough, but has been a step backwards compared to last year when everyone thought that there'd be a bit of momentum behind this team, not least of all him. But he has been having a really good year. I would put him solidly around the middle. For me, I don't know, I'm not convinced that it's quite so high. Alternatively, for my 5th anyway, I think we're talking 5th or 6th anyway, middle of the points, and logically I would, as an Australian, Oscar Piastri. Because we've talked a couple of times already in this episode, you're only as good as your last race. And that Belgian Grand Prix weekend was extremely impressive, in my opinion. Not only that, but the British Grand Prix weekend too. You can't really fault him for that. Should have finished right behind Lando Norris. It was only safety car problems that rocked up there. Damage meant he was a little bit less impressive in Hungary, but nonetheless, very quick in qualifying. Early stages of the race was right there. In machinery that's allowed him to show a little bit more of what he's got. And on top of that, show what he's developed in the first 10 to 12 races as it has been. He's really stepped up to the plate. Both Lando Norris and the team have been talking about how much he's pushing both Lando Norris and the team in qualifying, which I think, given everything we've said about Lando, is really impressive. And while we're talking about these rankings in terms of comparing to your teammate and your machinery, while maybe he's been, you could argue, a little bit further away from both compared to some other drivers, you've got to take into account the fact that he's a rookie, and a rookie who didn't drive in Formula One or anything last year. And throwing those 2 extra conditions into the mix, for me, means he's been really impressive. His first half of the season has not been, barring, I guess, Belgium and to a lesser extent Silverstone, headline acts, but has just been so impressively solid for his circumstances that I think he's a top 5 for me.
The one thing I'm always really cautious of, and this even goes back to the days of Mark Webber, is being overly Australian, if that makes sense. We look at things through a very particular viewpoint. And back in the day, I remember Sebastian Vettel, for instance, was absolutely pasted locally because he was Mark's teammate. And he got a rap that was undeserved. And I'm just very conscious of not going too far the other way and not heaping too much praise. Oscar is phenomenally good. This kid is absolutely a potential world champion. No bones about that. That's not the Australian in me. That's the opinion of the Formula One paddock. The people I spoke to in Belgium and Hungary, they are mighty impressed by what he's doing. And they're not people that are in McLaren. They're not people that are even associated directly with Oscar beyond just operating in the same sphere as what they do, as what he does in terms of Formula One. But I'm just conscious of overhyping him this early on. His performances have been good. I think what he did in Bahrain, he was caught up in the DRS train behind Lando Norris before he had the steering problem in the end, I think it was, or a hydraulics issue. In Saudi Arabia, obviously he qualified well and then picked up damage in the opening lap, which also triggered damage for Lando Norris. And they then ran quite closely together on very different strategies for the balance of the race. So he's been a good match for Lando at times. There's still some learning to be done, and there's promise to be seen. So I absolutely understand why you're putting Oscar as high up as you are, and he's absolutely in my top 10, no question of that. The positives that we're seeing are phenomenal. I think he has the potential. He's the only one on the grid that I would in 5 years mention the same breath right now as Max Verstappen. I don't see anyone else on the grid who's that good.
Big word. That's a big call.
You look at his junior career. He's delivered. You look at all the stuff that happened this time last year. Didn't faze him. You look at the success that he just missed out on in Silverstone, and he was disappointed, but he got on with it. Nothing phases him. Absolutely nothing. I've never seen a driver with this mentality. He is the complete package, and he's 12 races into his Formula One career. There's some learning to be done, and that's why I haven't put him higher on the list, because he has been beaten by Lando Norris to this point. there will become a point, and it's not that far away, that I think Oscar Piastri will start beating Lando Norris. We're not there yet, but I take your point in that when you add in that he's a rookie and everything else, what he's done is exceptional. But let's not look at that performance in the light of where does he rank in the top 10 of Formula One this year. Let's look at that of where is it going to lead him to in 5 years, or in 3 years even. Because I think we're at the very start of a journey. It's a little bit too early to suggest he's been one of the top 10 performers this year. But I think in 12 months' time, this is going to be a very different conversation.
Yeah, and look, worth remembering there as we hit the sort of halfway mark of our top 10 that this isn't necessarily a ranking of best drivers on the grid, even if you could rank something like that. This is purely just what we've seen in the first 12 races. So that's why you can have so many differences. But that's the great thing about ranking systems. It's all about opinion.
You're all wrong and I'm all right.
Yeah. You should see what they're saying in the comments. All right, so who's your number 6 then, I believe we're up to, or 7 for you perhaps?
Yeah, I think I'm going to put George Russell in there because he's been solid. He's been unspectacular, but that's kind of what you want from, I guess, a second driver, if you like. I don't think the Ferrari guys have been consistent enough. They'd be sort of the only others that I'd really consider in that position. So I think George Russell, given the machinery that he's had, has done enough. I don't think the other guys have done enough. And that's as far as my logic goes with that, basically. He's, I guess, the least worst, if that makes sense. It's not to say that what he's done is bad by any stretch of the imagination. Again, I can't think of a mistake that he's made, but he's just not had that ultimate performance that Lewis has had. Nor has he shone the way that, for me, Alex Albon, Guan Yu Zhou, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, and Max Verstappen have all shone as well. But he's still close enough to Lewis to make me think of him when I think of Mercedes. I don't think of Red Bull and instantly think of Sergio Perez. I think of Red Bull and I think of Max Verstappen. Similarly, there are other teams when I think of Williams, I think of Alex Albon. I don't necessarily think of Logan Sargent. But when I think of McLaren, I still think of Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. So I think he's just close enough to warrant a spot in the lower end of the top 10, certainly ahead of the Ferrari guys, because the Ferrari is not a nice car to drive. We know that. It's unpredictable. But the drivers there, I don't think have capitalised on what they've got. And as a result, George Russell beats them.
I like the logic of him claiming that Mercedes territory, and alongside Lewis Hamilton, obviously, not just Mercedes territory in its own right. I really like that as an argument. For me, between him and Charles Leclerc were really close, and I take what you're saying about Ferrari. I think not only the team, but the drivers have had a fairly imperfect season. The drivers, if you want to be maybe a little bit charitable, are having an imperfect season because the car has been so disappointing compared to last year. But for me, what puts Charles just ahead of George is that his qualifying performances have tended to be really good. And I like that despite the circumstances of this Ferrari year, when the car is working close to its maximum and when you can kind of move it into that groove, he got 2 pole positions, if we're calling sprint poles pole positions, in Azerbaijan.
Shootout poles.
Yeah. He's been able to push, even in Austria, I think, was within a 10th of Max. In recent races, he's always been really close in qualifying. Carlos Sainz had a decent qualifying run as well. It's always a little bit behind. He's a little bit further down in my rankings for what it's worth. But Charles, that's always been his strength. Some will argue he could be the quickest qualifier in the grid at the moment. It's hard to say because of the car, annoyingly. But in the last couple of years, you could probably argue that. And he's still able to show that despite the Ferrari probably being, now that McLaren's in the mix, could be 4th or even 5th quickest car. So for me, that puts him just ahead of George, just because he's been able to hit slightly higher highs despite the handicap of his machinery. But it is really close in 6th and 7th for Charles and George in my ranking.
So I put Charles and Carlos Sainz very close to one another because I think they've had similar years but slightly different. Charles, you're right, he is an exceptional qualifier, probably the fastest single-lap driver on the grid, but that Ferrari is also a single-lap car. It's not a car that works on weekends. Certainly not over a race stint. Certainly not from one set of tyres to the next, as we saw in Miami. And that's the event for me that is the big black mark for Leclerc, because he made a couple of mistakes off the top of my head there at the same corner as well. And he caused a red flag in qualifying, which hurt Max Verstappen. Then he crashed out of the race as well, if memory serves. So, yes, that car is difficult, but he's a world-class driver. He should be able to drive at points, even if not consistently, but give us a glimpse of something special. We've seen it from Alex Albon. I argue we've seen it from Guan Yu Zhou as well. We've certainly seen it from Lando Norris. Max has been doing it all year. Even when the car's not there, the absolute best drivers always find a way to shine. I mean, who would have thought in 2001 that some Spanish kid would turn out to be a double world champion in future driving a Minardi? But he found a way to shine. A little bit like Jules Bianchi did when he was driving for Marussia or Midland, not Midland, what were they, Manor? Midland. Wow, there's a whole other can of worms. So let's not go down there. I was just thinking red and white cars, you know.
Yeah.
But the best drivers find a way to shine, and I don't think that Charles this year has really shined. Similarly, I think this is a good opportunity for Carlos Sainz to really take it to Charles and show that he can lead a team, he can dominate, he can be Ferrari's number one, and I don't think he's done that either. He's a solid driver, but I don't think he's shown anything to me this year that tells me that he can be much more than a solid driver. Even though they've got a difficult car, I don't rate either of them above George Russell. In fact, I put them both just behind him. In fact, in 7th or 8th or wherever up to on your numbering. Follow along at home. They're both in the top 10, but I don't think they're better than George Russell.
I think that's fair. I think that's a fair call. Carlos Sainz has been a difficult one to rank for me. I've put him just behind George Russell, so my ranking there goes Leclerc, Russell, and Sainz. Because he's been quite consistent this year, but just hasn't hit the highs of either of the other two drivers, I think. He's occasionally shown it. In Belgium, he was pretty solid until race day, and again, talking about only as good as your last race, just didn't like his general reaction on Sunday. I think it would have been wiser for him. I know racing drivers aren't always prone to this, particularly immediately after getting out of the car, but recognising that he had a role to play in that, even if it were a racing incident, and just having a little bit of a crack at Oscar, I thought was a little bit unbecoming of a driver of his standing. But anyway, he's had a pretty solid season, and I do like that. Despite Charles Leclerc having what you might consider the emotional incumbency at Ferrari, it feels like there's always this will that he should be the lead driver. Carlos has never let him claim that position in any of their years together, even when the gap has appeared large. It's never been so large that you're saying, well, obviously Carlos is there to be the second driver. And I think that's credit-worthy, certainly considering the way Ferrari's tended to like to deal with its drivers. So for me, that's 6, 7, and 8. I'm guessing that you sound like you're rating them in that same group, but in a different order?
Yeah, very much. I've got George ahead of Charles and then Carlos. So pretty much that 3, we're talking a cigarette paper between them or a hair between them. There's very little to separate them, but I do put George ahead of Charles and then Carlos.
So behind them, I've got, and yes, these numbers will be written out in the description of this episode. Should have figured out the numbering a little bit earlier on. But we've already talked about him. You certainly already brought him up as a top 10. He's certainly a top 10 for me. It's Alex Albon. Just pretty consistent in the car, barring a few mistakes we've already talked about. But what's really impressed me, I think, is the way he's been able to execute ambitious strategies to score points. Like, that's a driver who is confident in himself, confident in the team, pretty much understands how to get the most out of a pretty difficult car. And a car that year to year has seemed to behave differently as well. It's not as if the Williams is always just bad in a particular way. It is draggy, we know that, and tends to be better in a straight line, but the car is just a little bit difficult. So I've really rated that. Who's your number 9, though, considering Alex was much higher for you?
Yeah, obviously, Alex was number 2 or 3 for me, wasn't he? I've actually got Esteban Ocon at number 9. I think he's outperformed Pierre Gasly at Alpine this year. Obviously, he's got the advantage of having a degree of tenure at Alpine versus what Pierre's just come in this year. But his performances, particularly Monaco for me, was very strong. And I think he's got the most out of that package, and also in light of recent developments, he's made the most out of that package in what must be extraordinarily difficult circumstances behind the scenes. So again, there's not been a really big headline reason as to he's only ninth best, because there's some pretty stiff competition ahead of him, some drivers who have excelled in their respective cars. He's not done a brilliant job, but he's made me take notice of him above Pierre Gasly, who is a driver that clearly Red Bull rated for a time. So Gasly's got some pedigree. He's obviously a race winner, as is Ocon a couple of years ago. And Ocon for me is the better of the two Alpine drivers. So for me, that gives him a nod into the top 10 but it puts him in the top 10 for me.
I have him in the unofficial, as it will be, just outside the top 10 rankings, because I think all your arguments stand up pretty much perfectly. They're pretty closely matched. I expected maybe a little bit more from Esteban Ocon, considering the incumbency value there, and maybe it's easy to forget, and maybe there's a reason we forget, but he was really highly rated when he arrived in Formula One, as was Pierre Gasly. But Ocon was the guy, was quicker than Max Verstappen in their junior years. He had a little bit of, had Mercedes backing as well, obviously, and there was the whole argument with Toto Wolff about not wanting him to drop out of Formula One and trying to defend him, all this kind of stuff. And there was reason for that, because he's a genuinely quick guy. So I expected maybe a little bit more from him in the context of putting Pierre Gasly away. But as you do fairly say, and certainly as we've learned recently, there is a lot going on at Alpine at the moment. So maybe we shouldn't expect too much from either driver in that context. But that brings us to the conclusion of the 10, the 10th place driver. Who have you got rounding out the top 10 of our hypothetical point scorers?
I've got Nico Hülkenberg.
Interesting.
He's come back from a couple of years away from the sport against a driver who seemed to have renewed vigour last year and was more confident and more relaxed, and driving as such as well. His performances last year, Kevin Magnussen's, were quite good. And Nico Hülkenberg has come in and looked the better of the two drivers. So I think that's an extraordinary performance based on his time out of the car, his lack of familiarity with the team. The fact that the team is also, it's got to be the least financed team on the grid, if that makes sense. Obviously, there's a budget cap now. I believe that Haas, if it's just, it might be just at the cost cap. We'll never really know. But what he's doing with that car, and it is a tricky car, it suffers many of the same issues that the Ferrari does, which is curious given how many of the components that Haas purchases from Ferrari, power unit, rear suspension, those sorts of things. There's some similar traits there. And yet there's been a couple of instances where you look at Nico Hülkenberg and Haas and you go, bloody hell, where'd that come from? I remember sitting in Austria and thinking, is he going to get a podium here? Is he going to finally get a podium here? Obviously he didn't, but that we were entertaining those thoughts, 12 months ago, he wasn't even a name in contention. And here he is. I think he's driven supremely well, outperformed a teammate that's more experienced in the car, much more experienced with the team. He's done over 100 Grands Prix with them. The headline results, again, they're just not going to be there. The car isn't there. The competition for the midfield is quite tight, but he still managed to outperform Kevin Magnussen by, 9 points to 2, which speaks to your point earlier, Michael, about, that's the greatest disparity percentage-wise between teammates. Obviously, again, the fact that they've scored so few impacts that, but it speaks to me of the quality of Nico Hülkenberg, his desire to be there, and just the guy's just natural talent. He's good. I don't know how he doesn't have a Formula One podium, and that's, for me, why he's in the top 10, because he's reminded me again, when he's had scant few opportunities to do so, he's reminded me that he is better than that car.
Well, I like those arguments, certainly coming in realistically, 3 years on the sidelines, bar a couple of COVID-inspired cameos, many of which were quite impressive as well. It's got to be said. At least one of which, I'm thinking it was back in 2020, substituting Sergio Perez. He also looked like he might be on for a podium. Was that a front row start in Silverstone from memory, or a top 3 start in Silverstone?
Yeah, that was the one where you got the phone call while he was sitting in a coffee shop, wasn't it?
Famous.
Yeah, and had to hightail it out to Silverstone. Yeah, I remember him being particularly impressive that week. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Someone in the comments chuck that into Wikipedia and drop it in the comments for us. It's the guy's just impressive. I don't know how he sits there with the record that he does, because he's so much better than those numbers. He reminds me a little bit of Jean Alesi. He won one race in his entire career. He should have won so much more. Stefano Modena. Vitantonio Liuzzi, all these drivers who've come in and have had so much promise, and then for whatever reason their careers just never lived up to it. He's one of those, and if he retires without a Formula One podium, it will be an absolute travesty.
Yeah, I mean, that will be the interesting statistic, won't it? Because we don't know how much longer he'll be around in Formula One. This is a second wind, I suppose, and as Fernando Alonso, at least among them, is proving, you can race for quite a lot longer than many people had assumed. I'll conclude with my top 10, though, with Yuki Tsunoda, the man who has destroyed the Formula One career of Nick De Vries in just 10 races. I feel like that is, no disrespect to Nick De Vries, of course, he's a great driver in his own right, but I feel like that is creditable when your only bar is always your teammate in Formula One. Obviously, we've got this now interesting narrative of him up against Daniel Ricciardo. We've only had 2 races. It's just too hard to draw conclusions. You could argue I would argue that Daniel, after 2 races, deserves to be pretty much bang in the middle, more or less. But that's purely because we don't have any data. We don't have enough data, rather. We've had 2 rounds, performed really well in one, performed okay in the other. And that goes the same for Yuki. If we're talking about these 2 rounds particularly, had a really good Belgium, kind of average Hungary. He talks a little bit afterwards about just the change of circumstances and putting a little bit too much pressure on himself. So that'll be really fascinating to see what unfolds in the second half of the year. But given this is the first half of the year rankings, it's hard to go past just the domination of his teammate in what is a pretty ordinary car, in what is against the background of a team that is going through changes, not only in a management sense, but there was a lot of speculation earlier in the year that the team could be moved or sold or restructured. And he was consistent pretty much throughout the entire first half of the year, and scored the team's only points as we know and have talked about so far. So for me, he deserves a top 10 berth, and he just sneaks in 10.
Yeah, I did roll around Yuki Tsunoda's name in my head as to whether he justifies a berth, and I think if this was taken pre-Hungary, I'd have put him. I know some of the drivers ranked him just before the break in their top 3. Which is an extraordinarily high position for him, which suggests that they've been impressed with what he's been doing. And before Hungary, I'd have probably put him in the top 10 quite comfortably. But the reason I've stopped short of that is twofold. One, Daniel's performance in Hungary. He came in and he beat Yuki Tsunoda day one. Now that says a bit about Daniel, but it also tells me a bit about Yuki as well. And what that tells me is that, well, maybe he wasn't getting the most out of the car. Maybe he wasn't doing that good a job. For someone to come in and beat him having no knowledge of that car, well, how good is he? Now, he rebounded a little bit in Belgium, but for me, that took a big part of the shine off Yuki Tsunoda's season. The other reason is the whole, and you mentioned it right up at the top there, where you say he destroyed Nick De Vries' career. And yes, there's absolutely an argument that you can make to that. Ian Parks, my offsider at Speed Cafe, he's currently sunning himself on a beach in France, I think. He's based out of the UK, so we've got, while I'm sleeping, he can work. It's great. He spoke with Christian Horner just before the break. As you listen to this, I'm not sure if we've published this story or not, but it's certainly coming if it hasn't onto Speed Cafe. De Vries never looked like a Red Bull driver to Christian Horner, and that's the reason he's no longer in the program. AlphaTauri, and to its predecessor, Toro Rosso, that team was, in Horner's words, designed to bed in the next wave of Red Bull drivers. So if a driver's not looking like a Red Bull driver, why continue that relationship? They're Christian Horner's words, not mine. But I see the logic there is that if they see that Nick isn't going to make it, there's a theory in economics where your first loss is your least. So you cut the tyres there and then you've done the least damage. What were they going to gain? If they know he's not going to be part of the Red Bull program long term, what do they gain by keeping him around for a year? So regardless, I think, of Yuki Tsunoda's performance, Nick had a finite lifespan there anyway. If he hadn't won over Christian Horner, he was always going to be on the outer, you'd have thought, at the end of the year. As a result, again, pre-Hungary, I'd have bought into the he's destroyed Nick de Vries argument. Now I put less weight into that as well. And as a result, Yuki's performances are less impressive to me. It's not to say he hasn't done a good job. I think he has. He's probably just outside my 10. I'll put him 11th in my standings. But for those two reasons, Daniel's performance and Christian's comments, I wouldn't put him in my top 10. But I also like your point that we don't have enough data on Daniel, so you put him right smack bang in the middle of that bell curve because we don't know if he's good or bad yet. We'll wait and see. Yeah, it'd be interesting to come back and revisit this at the end of the season. And I dare say it's probably something that we will do.
Yeah.
Just have a bit of a giggle and see how far off or how close we actually were. But I think Yuki Tsunoda over the back half of this season is going to be a fascinating story to watch because this is a really crucial moment in his career and his development. His Formula One career could go one of two ways at this point. That's my read on it, and it's entirely up to him which way that goes.
One of the many fascinating narratives we'll have for the second half of the year, but that is for a future episode. Next week we'll be previewing the Dutch Grand Prix and, of course, what we're looking forward to in the second half of the season. The end of which, yes, we will do another rankings, inevitably. It seems like an obvious thing we'll be doing after Abu Dhabi all the way in November. But that's all the time we have for Pit Talk this week, this quite long episode of Pit Talk this week. So hope you've stuck with us and leave in the comments your, not only reviews of our top 10s, but your own top 10s. Obviously, you can't criticize ours if you don't leave your own and justify them. It'll be fascinating to compare them, and you can have all kinds of discussions wherever you're watching or listening to this, whether it's on YouTube or on your podcast app of choice or on the social media channels for Fox Sports and Speed Cafe. We'll be back next week to preview the Dutch Grand Prix and, as I said, the second half of the year. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube. Just search for Fox Sports Australia. Until then, from Matt Kosh, my name's Michael Laminato, and we'll catch you next time.